Imagine being trapped in a place where the snow never stops falling, where something dark and ancient is waiting for you in the cold silence. Each story takes you deeper into California's winter nightmares, where whispers in the woods, haunted cabins, and vengeful spirits lurk just beyond the snow. As the storm grows stronger, the terror only intensifies. Can you survive until the end? Watch all 10 stories and uncover the chilling secrets hidden in the snow. Stay tuned till the very end. You won't want to miss what's waiting in the dark. Story 10. The Frozen Tree. Mike had always been the skeptical one. His brother, Kyle, was the dreamer, always getting lost in stories of the supernatural, constantly finding ghost towns, legends, and ancient myths that he swore were true. So when Kyle invited him for a weekend trip to a small, secluded cabin in the Northern California woods, Mike was hesitant. It wasn't the destination that bothered him. It was the journey his brother had in mind. "Come on, Mike," Kyle had pleaded. Over the phone, "You need a break. This place is perfect. Quiet, peaceful, and perfect for some bro time." Mike had agreed mostly out of obligation and admittedly curiosity. The idea of spending a few days away from the hustle of city life and the strain of work wasn't the worst thing in the world. Still, Mike had no idea that what awaited them would challenge everything he believed about reality. The cabin was nestled deep within a thick, dense forest untouched by time. It was an older building, with dark wood paneling and large stone fireplaces, the kind of rustic charm that looked like it belonged in an old fairy tale. The winter had already settled in, covering the ground in a thick blanket of snow that glittered under the pale sun, which hung low in the sky. It was early December, and the winds howled through the trees as they arrived, the chill in the air almost biting. Kyle had been excited as ever, rushing to unpack the car while Mike lingered, surveying their surroundings with a frown. "Isn't this place a little too remote?" Mike asked, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his thick winter jacket. "I mean, if anything goes wrong, we're miles away from civilization." Kyle grinned, clearly unfazed. "Exactly. Isn't that the point? It's peaceful." They unloaded their gear and set up inside, making the cabin feel warmer with a few fires. In the hearth and a bottle of whiskey, Mike found himself staring out of the windows more often than he would have liked. There was something about the woods, something unfamiliar and unsettling. The trees, towering and heavy with snow, seemed to lean inward as if watching them, waiting. Later that evening, after they had settled in, Kyle suggested they take a walk through the forest. Mike was hesitant at first. It was getting dark, and the temperature had dropped considerably, but Kyle insisted. "The best way to experience this place is to walk through it at night," Kyle urged. "Trust me, you'll love it." "No?" Real excuse to avoid it, Mike reluctantly agreed. They donned their boots and thick coats, leaving the warmth of the cabin behind as they ventured into the woods. The moon was nearly full, casting a ghostly light over the snow-covered ground. The forest was silent, except for the crunch of their footsteps on the snow and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches above. They walked for nearly an hour, lost in the quiet of the night, until they came upon something that stopped them in their tracks. In the middle of a small clearing stood a massive tree. It was unlike any other tree in the forest. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, with thick roots that seemed to coil into the earth like snakes. But what caught their attention was the ice covering the tree, from its roots to the top of its branches. It wasn't snow or frost. The tree was encased in solid ice, like something from another world. Kyle approached it first, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Wow, look at this," he murmured, touching the ice with his gloved hand. It's frozen in time." Mike frowned, feeling a strange unease settle in his stomach. "This doesn't seem natural." I've never seen anything like this, Kyle said, a glint of excitement in his eyes. We have to get closer. They walked up to the base of the tree, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. As they circled it, Mike noticed something else. Faint carvings on the trunk, deep scratches that seemed to be etched into the ice itself. He leaned in to inspect them. The markings were strange, almost ritualistic in nature. They seemed to form patterns, symbols that didn't belong to any language he knew. What do you think they are? Mike asked, his voice quiet, a sense of dread creeping into his chest. Kyle was already running his hands over the carvings, tracing them. I don't know. They're definitely old ... Maybe this tree is some sort of, I don't know, ancient marker? A totem of some kind? Before Mike could respond, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, making the trees groan and creak. The temperature dropped further, and a sudden, intense coldness enveloped them. Kyle shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him. I think we should head back, Mike said, his voice tense, but Kyle wasn't listening. He was transfixed by the tree, staring at it with an almost reverent look in his eyes. There's something strange about this tree, Mike, he muttered, his voice low. I feel like it's calling me. Mike's gut twisted. Kyle, don't touch it. But it was too late. Kyle reached out, his fingers brushing against the ice. The moment his skin made contact, the air around them seemed to change. The wind howled violently, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Kyle jerked his hand back, his face contorted with pain. What the hell? He gasped, clutching his fingers as if they'd been burned. But there was no visible injury. Mike grabbed his brother's arm, pulling him away from the tree. We need to leave now. But as they turned to go, the ground beneath them cracked, and a deep, rumbling noise filled the air. The forest seemed to come alive with movement, as if the trees themselves were shifting. Bending toward them, the ice-covered tree began to glow faintly, its carvings glowing like embers in the dark. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy. Run! Mike shouted, dragging Kyle away from the clearing. They ran, their breath coming in panicked gasps, their boots slipping on the snow as they stumbled back toward the cabin. Behind them, the forest seemed to pulse with an ancient power, the trees creaking and groaning as if alive. The wind howled, carrying with it the low, guttural sound of something far older than them. They finally made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut. Behind them, panting and covered in snow, they collapsed on the floor, trying to catch their breath. Kyle's hands were shaking, his face pale. What the hell was that? Mike gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Kyle didn't answer. He was staring at the window, his eyes wide with fear. The tree. It's not just a tree. Mike looked out the window, and his blood ran cold. The clearing was still there, the tree still standing, but now it was no longer covered in ice. The ice was melting, dripping slowly from the branches. And in its place, there was something else, something watching them. A figure, cloaked in shadows, stood by the tree, its face obscured. The moonlight illuminated it just enough to see that it was not human, its silhouette tall and twisted. It was as if it had been waiting for them all along. Get inside now! Kyle screamed, bolting away from the window. We need to leave. But before they could make a move, a loud knock came from the door. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud, like a drumbeat. It reverberated through the cabin, shaking the walls. Mike froze, his mind racing. No one should be out there. He hesitated for a moment, but then another thud came, louder this time, followed by a voice low, guttural, and unmistakably ancient ... double quotes, leave ... or become one with the tree. The door splintered with the next knock, and for the briefest moment, Mike caught a glimpse of the figure, its glowing eyes, locked onto his dot, and the world went dark. Story 9. The Winter Rites. Jess had never been one for tradition. She'd always considered herself a city girl at heart, more comfortable in a bustling cafe in San Francisco than in the middle of nowhere. But when her boyfriend, Kyle, suggested they spend a weekend in a small mountain village for the holidays, she begrudgingly agreed. She had heard a lot about the village from Kyle's family, who claimed it was a peaceful retreat. But Jess had also heard rumors, a quiet town where people kept to themselves, and strange customs were observed. Kyle reassured her, though. He insisted it was a perfect getaway, a place to unwind, to escape the holiday stress. The village of Alderbrook was nestled high in the Sierra Nevada mountains, hidden away behind a veil of towering trees. As Jess and Kyle drove through the snow-capped roads, the village appeared in the distance, like something out of a Christmas postcard. The houses were small, the kind with smoke curling from chimneys, surrounded by thick pine forests. Snow had just begun to fall again, lightly dusting the roofs and the streets. Everything seemed still, as if the whole world had been covered by a blanket of snow, leaving only the sound of their tires crunching on the icy road dot as they approached the village center. Jess noticed something peculiar. The town was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it too. The streets were eerily quiet, and the people they passed seemed distant. Their eyes were cold, their greetings clipped. No one smiled. Jess had a nagging feeling that she couldn't shake, like she was being watched, even though the village appeared to be asleep under the weight of winter. "We're here," Kyle said, snapping Jess from her thoughts. He pointed to a small inn, a quaint stone building with a sign that read the Pinecrest Inn. The place looked cozy, with twinkling lights framing the windows. Jess sighed, trying to push away the unease that had settled in her chest dot inside. The innkeeper, a woman named Madeline, greeted them with a stiff smile. She was older, her gray hair pulled tightly back in a bun, and her sharp eyes never seemed to leave them. "Welcome," she said, her voice polite but distant. "You'll be comfortable here. We're glad to have visitors this time of year. The winter can be isolating." Jess tried to ignore the way Madeline's words felt heavy with hidden meaning. She just wanted to get settled, and maybe after a good night's sleep, the strange feeling would pass. Madeline showed them to their room, a modest, wood-paneled space with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt. A fireplace crackled quietly in the corner, and the scent of pine filled the air. As Jess unpacked, she noticed that the room had an odd chill to it, despite the warmth from the fire. She didn't think much of it, though, until she noticed the small, intricate carvings on the wooden beams near the ceiling. They resembled symbols almost like runes carved into the wood, faded with age. Jess shivered, but said nothing to Kyle, who seemed preoccupied with looking out the window at the falling snow. That evening, they decided to go to the village's only restaurant, a rustic place called the Snowfall Tavern. It was the only building that seemed alive, with lights glowing warmly through the frosted windows. As they entered, the low murmur of conversation died down, and the patrons turned to look at them. Jess couldn't help but feel as though they were intruding on something they didn't belong to. Kyle didn't seem to notice, chatting with the bartender as they took their seats at the bar. "We don't get many visitors this time of year," the bartender, a man named Peter, explained, with a forced smile. "Most people prefer to stay inside. Not much to do outside in this kind of weather." He paused, glancing around the room as if searching for something. "Except for the winter rites, of course." Jess tilted her head. "The winter rites?" Peter's eyes shifted, and his smile faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "Oh, it's an old tradition. You'll see, no doubt. The villagers gather for it every winter, a way to honor the season. It's a big part of life here." Jess wasn't sure what to make of his answer. The whole town seemed to be hiding something, and the more she learned, the more she wanted to leave. But Kyle, ever the optimist, seemed fascinated by the ritual. He leaned in, asking Peter more questions about the winter rites. The bartender was more than happy to oblige, explaining how the villagers would come together at the edge of the forest for the ceremony, a practice passed down for centuries. Why? Do they do it? Jess asked, her curiosity growing. What exactly happens? Peter's eyes darkened. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. It's a celebration of the turning of the year, a way of ensuring prosperity. But he glanced over his shoulder at the other patrons, who were still staring at them, their faces unreadable. It's not for outsiders. Don't get too involved, or you might regret it. Jess felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine at his warning. Sounds ... ominous. Peter's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's just tradition. It's nothing for you to worry about. Later that evening, after they had returned to the inn, Jess couldn't shake the sense of dread that followed her. She lay awake in bed, listening to the wind howl outside, her mind racing. The winter rites, the strange behavior of the villagers, something didn't feel right. Kyle had already fallen asleep beside her, but Jess couldn't close her eyes. The silence in the inn was oppressive, and the coldness in the room felt like it was seeping into her bones. That's when she heard it, a soft knock on the door. Startled, she sat up in bed, her heart racing. She glanced at Kyle, but he was still fast asleep. The knock came again, louder this time. It was as though someone or something was waiting for her. Hesitantly, Jess got out of bed and walked to the door, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. She opened it just a crack and was greeted by the sight of Madeline, her expression as stern as ever. "I'm sorry to disturb you, dear," Madeline said quietly, "but there's something you should know about the winter rites. You must be careful. Don't participate. It's not safe for outsiders. Some traditions are meant to stay in the past." Jess opened her mouth to ask more questions, but Madeline was already gone, slipping silently into the hallway. The next morning, Kyle was eager to explore the town and learn more about the winter rites. He was excited, naive, and unaware of the darkness surrounding the village. He had grown up hearing about the traditions of the place, fascinated by the stories of how the villagers had kept their rituals alive through the years. As they walked through the village, Jess noticed something strange. Everyone seemed to be preparing for something. The streets were crowded with people going about their business, but there was an urgency in their movements. Children were kept inside, and the stores were filled with offerings of food, candles, and strange ornaments. At the edge of the village stood a clearing, where an altar had been set up. It was adorned with wreaths made from pine branches, flowers that were fresh despite the deep winter chill, and strange animal bones hung from the trees. Swaying gently in the wind, Jess's unease grew, and she tugged at Kyle's sleeve. "Feels wrong. I don't want to be here." But Kyle was already walking toward the altar, drawn by something he couldn't explain. "It's just a ceremony, Jess. It's all part of the tradition." As they approached, they were met by the village. Elders, tall, stern-looking people who wore robes adorned with the same symbols Jess had seen in the cabin. The leader, an old woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, turned to them with a smile. "You've arrived just in time," she said, her voice low and gravelly. "It's an honor to have outsiders witness the winter rites. But remember, the forest gives and the forest takes." Jess shuddered at her words. Something wasn't right, but Kyle was already too caught up in the ceremony to notice as the ritual began. The villagers formed a circle around the altar, chanting in a language Jess didn't understand. Their voices grew louder and more frantic, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the chant. Kyle stood in the center, entranced, while Jess stayed at the edge, Unable to look away, but too terrified to get closer, the air grew thick with an unnatural energy. Jess felt a pull, like something in the earth itself was calling to her. But when she looked around, she realized that the faces of the villagers had changed, twisted, distorted by something ancient and malevolent. The woman who had welcomed them stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a strange, unholy light. "The time has come," she said, her voice echoing in the cold air. "The forest demands a sacrifice." Jess's heart raced. She looked around frantically, trying to find Kyle, but he was standing in the center of the circle, his eyes wide as if under a spell. The villagers were closing in, their chants growing louder. They were preparing for something, and Jess knew, deep down, that it was something she wasn't meant to witness. The woman reached out, placing her hand on Kyle's shoulder. Jess screamed his name, but it was too late. The ground beneath them began to shake, and the earth split open, revealing a deep, dark pit. The village had never just been a place of tradition. It was a place of darkness, and now Kyle was part of it. Story 8. The White Fog. Emma had never believed in the supernatural. She had always considered herself a woman of logic, a skeptic who preferred cold facts and practical explanations over ghost stories and local myths. But all of that changed. One winter, when she took a trip to a small coastal town in Northern California. The town, called Ashwood, was known for its history, its old-world charm, and its dense fog that seemed to roll in from the sea every night, thick and suffocating. It was the perfect place to escape from the hectic pace of city life and the relentless noise of technology. Emma was looking for quiet, not for answers to questions she didn't have. When she arrived, the town seemed almost too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Ashwood was nestled between towering cliffs and the ocean, its streets winding and narrow, with old buildings lining each side. The fog that rolled in at dusk made the town feel isolated from the rest of the world, as if it existed in some sort of perpetual twilight. Emma was taken by its eerie beauty, but there was something unsettling about it too. Every time she passed someone on the street, they would look at her quick glances, the kind that suggested they were sizing her up. It was as though everyone knew something she didn't. The inn she stayed in was charming, old-fashioned, but cozy, with a crackling fire in the lobby and the scent of pine in the air. The innkeeper, a woman named Margaret, was kind but reserved, always giving Emma odd little smiles that didn't reach her eyes. The fog comes in thick around this time of year, Margaret had said when Emma checked in, her voice low and almost apologetic. "It's a blessing, I suppose, but it's also a bit much for some. You'll get used to it, though. Most folks here do. Just remember, don't go out in it after dark." Emma had nodded, thinking little of the warning. It was winter. It was cold. The fog was just another thing that added to the charm of the town. She hadn't imagined how real the danger of the fog would become. The first few days passed without incident. Emma explored the town, finding small antique shops, quiet cafes, and the occasional bookstore. She was content, keeping to herself, enjoying the isolation. But by the third night, things began to feel different. The fog had settled. And early that evening, thicker than usual, rolling over the streets like a living thing. It felt oppressive, as though the world outside had disappeared. Emma had just finished a cup of tea in the inn's dining room when the feeling started, an overwhelming sense of being watched. She couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything overt. There were no eyes staring at her, no whispering voices in the corner. It was just a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the same feeling you get when you're aware that someone is behind you but can't quite see them. She looked around the room, but it was empty save for a few scattered guests. No one was looking at her. No one was paying her any mind. But the feeling lingered. Emma excused herself and went up to her room, Hoping a change of scenery would ease her nerves. As she reached her door, she noticed something strange. The hallway outside was shrouded in an almost unnatural darkness. The faint light from the sconces on the wall barely cut through the thick fog that had crept into the inn. It was like the fog had infiltrated the building itself. Emma hesitated, her hand resting on the doorknob, and she glanced down the hallway. The shadowy figures at the far end of the corridor seemed to distort, twisting with the fog, as though something was moving behind the mist. A cold draft swept through the hallway, and Emma felt the hairs on her arms stand up. But she was tired, and the rational part of her mind told her to stop imagining things. She entered her room, locked the door, and sat by the window, watching the fog swirl outside. The town was still. The fog was thick, and the air was damp and cold. It was then that she heard it, a soft, echoing sound from below. It was faint, but unmistakable. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to carry, as if someone was speaking just below her window. Emma strained to listen, but she couldn't make out the words. She stood up, her curiosity getting the better of her, and opened the window just a crack, trying to hear better. The fog outside was so thick that she couldn't see past the first few feet below her window. But the voice came again, a soft whisper, this time louder, clearer. "Come to me." Emma froze. Her heart raced. She hadn't expected it to sound so personal. Whoever was speaking knew she was there. The voice echoed again, insistent yet distant. "Come come to me." It was unmistakable, and it sent a cold shiver down her spine. She slammed the window shut and backed away, her thoughts racing. What kind of person would stand outside in the fog at this hour? Who would whisper like that? Her mind screamed at her to call the police, but something kept her frozen in place. What could she say? Someone was standing in the fog, whispering her name? No, that would make her sound crazy. But the voice didn't stop. It lingered, drifting through the walls like a faint song on the wind. Emma pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders, but it felt like the room was growing colder by the minute. Second, the fog outside pressed against the window, thickening and growing heavier. The next morning, Emma went downstairs, her mind still rattling from the events of the night before. Margaret greeted her with the same polite, almost apologetic smile. "The fog is heavier than usual today," Margaret remarked casually. "It tends to get thick like this before something happens." "Something happens?" Emma asked, her voice more nervous than she intended. Margaret nodded, her smile fading just a bit. "Yes, it always does. The fog doesn't come in just for the weather. You'll see." "See what?" Emma's voice was shaky, but Margaret simply smiled and walked away, leaving Emma standing there with a chill creeping up her spine. The days that followed were strange. The fog refused to lift, and with it came a growing sense of dread. Emma felt more and more disconnected from the town, as if she were being pulled into a strange, dreamlike state. She didn't venture out much, choosing instead to stay in her room, reading, trying to shake the feeling that the town, the inn, and the fog were all part of a slow, inevitable trap. The whispers continued every night, growing louder, more insistent. But it was on the fourth night that it happened, the night Emma could no longer ignore. What was happening? She had gone to bed early, exhausted, her body aching from the restless nights. The whispers came again, but this time they were clearer than ever before. "Come come to me, The voice was closer, almost as if it were inside her room. Emma's heart pounded as she sat up in bed, her eyes darting around the room. The fog pressed against the window, but the air inside was still, too still. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Come Come to me, She couldn't ignore it anymore. Her feet moved before her brain had time to stop her, as if some force beyond her control was pulling her toward the door. She stood, her body trembling, and opened the door of her room. The hallway was dark, the fog creeping along the edges of the walls. The same eerie atmosphere from the night before, now more oppressive, like it was suffocating her. Without thinking, Emma walked down the hallway. The farther she walked, the louder the voice became. It was almost as if it were inside her head now, a constant, insistent pull. Come to me? At the end of the hallway stood a door. It wasn't one she recognized. It wasn't part of her room, nor was it part of the normal inn layout. The door was old wooden, and its handle was twisted as though it had been untouched for years. But something about it called to her. Her hand reached for the door, trembling, and as soon as she touched the handle, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into complete darkness. The whispers were deafening now. They felt like they were coming from every direction. Emma stepped down the stairs. The air grew colder the farther she descended, and the fog seemed to intensify, swirling around her in the dark like a living thing. At the bottom of the stairs, Emma found herself in an old, damp cellar. The walls were covered in strange symbols. Etched deep into the stone. In the center of the cellar stood a tall, slender figure, cloaked in dark robes, its face hidden in shadow. Its hand was outstretched, beckoning her forward. Come. The voice urged again, now directly in her mind. Come and see. Emma wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. She stepped closer to the figure, drawn by an invisible force. As she approached, the figure turned, and for the first time, Emma saw its face. It was her own. Story 7. The Snowblind Stranger. Rachel had always been the adventurous type, but even she had her limits. So when she found herself driving through a snowstorm in Northern California, headed to a remote cabin she had rented for the weekend, she couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. The winter roads were treacherous, the snow heavy, and the visibility low. Still, her decision to go up into the mountains was final. She needed to disconnect away from the city, away from the pressures of life. A weekend alone, in the quiet, seemed perfect. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was a small rustic place, with dark wood paneling, a fireplace, and large windows that overlooked the snow-covered trees. It looked like something out of a postcard, and for a moment Rachel felt a surge of contentment. The world outside seemed distant, and the storm that raged just beyond the cabin only made the place feel cozier. Rachel unpacked, lit the fire, and poured herself a drink. She had a feeling of peace, the kind you get when you know you have the whole world to yourself. The storm outside only made the cabin feel like a sanctuary, a place to relax and escape. She pulled out a book and settled into an armchair, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. Hours passed. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling against the walls of the cabin. Rachel glanced at the clock, already well past midnight. She felt a twinge of unease creep up her spine. The snow had covered the driveway completely, and there was no sign of anyone coming or going. But then, just as she was about to stand up and stoke the fire, she heard it. A knock. Rachel froze. Her hand hovered over the fire poker, her heart skipping. A beat. Who could be out there? It was impossible for anyone to drive through the snowstorm. The cabin was isolated. No one had passed her on the way up, and there was no way someone could have made it through the blizzard. Another knock. This time louder, more urgent. Rachel's mind raced. She stood up, grabbed a heavy flashlight from the side table, and cautiously walked toward the door. The storm outside was deafening, the wind howling in the distance. She peered through the small window beside the door, but saw nothing. Another knock this time. A single heavy thud dot with her breath held. Rachel opened the door just a crack, the cold air rushing in. There, standing in the snow, was a man. His figure was hunched, his face obscured by a thick hood and layers of snow, his breath coming out in puffs of mist. His clothes were torn, as though he had been out in the snow far too long. His eyes were hidden behind thick, dark glasses, and his hands were tucked into the folds of his coat. "Can I help you?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his face now only a few inches away from hers. She could feel the cold radiating off him. "Please, please let me in," he croaked, his voice raspy and hoarse. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to close the door, but something in his eyes, something lost and desperate, stopped her. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was he hurt? Should she let him in? But the snowstorm outside was fierce, and she couldn't leave him out there in the cold. I'm sorry. I don't know you," Rachel said, taking a cautious step back. "How did you get here? The roads are closed. There's no way you could have come up in this storm." The man's response was chilling. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. "I've been walking for hours," he said, his voice growing weaker. I got lost. Please, I don't know how much longer I can stay out here." Rachel hesitated. The storm was brutal, and the man did look like he was in trouble. Still, something felt off. She wanted to help, but she had no idea who this person was or what his intentions were. And yet, her compassion overtook her caution. She opened the door fully. "Come inside quickly," Rachel said, stepping aside to let him enter. The man stumbled in, his body shivering from the cold. His glasses fogged up as soon as he entered the warmth of the cabin, and he pulled them off with a trembling hand. Rachel caught a glimpse of his eyes, pale and hollow, as though they had seen far too much. But before she could say anything, he collapsed onto the nearest armchair, his breath coming in labored gasps. Rachel moved quickly to make him a cup of tea, trying to shake off the unease that clung to her. The man was clearly in need, and she couldn't leave him to freeze outside. But something about his presence was unsettling. She could still feel the coldness radiating off him, even with the fire burning in the hearth dot. As she handed him the tea, she couldn't help but ask, "What happened to you? How did you get so far out here?" The man took the tea, holding the cup in both hands, but not drinking it. His eyes were distant, his gaze unfocused, as though he were lost in thought. I don't know," he said softly. "I was on my way to the nearest town. But the snow, it came so fast. I couldn't find my way out of the woods. I lost track of time." Rachel frowned. "That doesn't make sense. There's no way you could have walked that far, not in this weather." The man's eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment there was something unsettling in his gaze, something wild, desperate. "It wasn't the weather that got me lost," he muttered, his voice low. "It was the fog." Rachel's brow furrowed. "Fog? It's snowing, not foggy." The man stared at her, his expression growing darker. "Not the kind of fog you're thinking of. It's something else, something that comes with the snow." Rachel's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" He leaned forward in the chair, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have walked into the fog. You don't understand. You can't see it. But it sees you." Rachel's heart raced. "What's in the fog?" The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. "It's not the fog you should be worried about. It's what's waiting for you once you step into it. The thing that follows you." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The room grew colder, despite the fire burning in the hearth. The man's hands were shaking now, his face pale and drawn. "I saw it coming for me." Before she could ask more, the man suddenly stood up, his movements erratic. It's here. It's always here, waiting. He stumbled toward the door, but Rachel grabbed his arm, pulling him back. No, you're not going out there. You'll freeze to death. He looked at her, his face twisted in a mix of fear and disbelief. You don't understand. It's not the cold. It's not the snow. It's the thing in the fog. If you leave now, you'll never be the same. Rachel's grip tightened around his arm, panic flooding her senses. You need to calm down. There's no fog. There's no monster. There's just a snowstorm. You're exhausted and you're hallucinating. But before she could say anything more, the lights in the cabin flickered. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows as though it were trying to break in. The fire crackled wildly, casting large, dancing shadows on the walls. And then the knock came dotted first. It was soft, a single sharp rap against the door. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she looked toward the door, her body frozen in fear. The man beside her stood perfectly still, his face pale, his lips trembling. He was staring at the door, as though he already knew what was coming. The knock came again, louder this time. And then the door rattled violently. Who's there? Rachel called, her voice shaky. No answer. But then the whispering started, coming from outside the door. It was soft at first, like the wind, but as it grew louder, she could hear words that didn't make sense, words that sounded like they were coming from 1,000 voices at once. Rachel. She looked at the man beside her, his eyes wide with terror. It's here, he whispered, his voice a ghostly echo. It's here. It's coming for both of us now. Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for the door. The cold from outside seeped through the wood, a deep chill that made her skin crawl. The whispering continued, growing louder, more desperate, and then the door slammed open. Story 6. The Frozen Cemetery. Greg had never been a fan of winter. Growing up in California, where the sun blazed for most of the year, winter was a foreign concept. But after a sudden promotion at work, he found himself with a week off, and instead of spending it in the predictable warmth of Los Angeles, he decided to head up to the cold, desolate town of Pinebrook for a change of pace. The town was tucked away in the Sierra Nevadas, an area known for its isolated beauty, and Greg thought it would be the perfect place to disconnect from the chaos of the city. He rented a small cabin just outside of town. It was the off-season for tourists, so the place was quiet, almost too quiet. Pinebrook was small, mostly consisting of a few old shops, a diner, and a collection of cottages and cabins scattered throughout the surrounding woods. The snow had already begun to blanket the ground, turning the streets and forests into a surreal, white landscape. Greg enjoyed the peace at first. He spent his days hiking through the snow-covered woods and his nights by the fire, catching up on reading. But as the days passed, a strange feeling began to creep over him. It wasn't just the silence. It was the sensation that something or someone was watching him. He couldn't explain it, but every time he stepped outside, he felt as if eyes were following him, hidden in the trees, just beyond his line of sight. That it was on the 5th day of his stay that Greg's unease escalated. He had decided to explore the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, one that the locals had warned him to avoid. Pinebrook Cemetery was ancient, dating back to the early 1800s, and according to the rumors, it was a place that no one visited after dark. Some said it was haunted, others claimed the ground was cursed. Greg, always the skeptic, had brushed these stories aside, convinced they were just small-town superstitions. But on this cold afternoon, with the snow falling in heavy sheets, Greg decided to investigate for himself. He set off on foot, walking through the winding streets of Pinebrook until he reached the cemetery. As he crossed the iron gate, a strange chill seemed to settle in the air, and the hairs on the back of his Next stood up. The cemetery was as eerie as he had imagined. The gravestones were old and weathered, some tilted at odd angles, others barely legible with time and frost. The ground was frozen solid, and the trees that surrounded the cemetery appeared like skeletal arms reaching out of the snow. It was peaceful but unsettling, as though the very earth itself was hiding something dark. Buried deep beneath the frozen soil. Greg wandered among the graves, snapping pictures here and there, captivated by the eerie beauty of the place. He was so caught up in the atmosphere that he didn't notice the figure standing in the distance, near the farthest corner of the cemetery. It was a tall, hunched figure, cloaked in black, its face obscured by the shadows of the trees. Greg tried to brush off the feeling of unease creeping over him, convincing himself that it was just another local who had come to visit a family grave. But as he drew closer, the figure didn't move. "Hey!" Greg called out, hoping to break the silence. "You need help?" The figure remained still, its back turned toward Greg, as if it hadn't heard him. A cold gust of wind blew, causing the trees to creak and groan. Greg shivered but continued toward the figure. He was almost there when suddenly the figure turned, its face hidden under a hood. It was as though it had been waiting for him. Greg stopped in his tracks. There was something about the way the figure stood unnatural, rigid, like it wasn't quite human. The air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if the world was holding its breath. "Are you all right?" Greg asked, his voice a little shakier than he intended. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to walk, slowly, toward the farthest corner of the cemetery. Greg's heart started to race, a gut feeling telling him that this was no ordinary person. There was something wrong about the figure. The way it moved, its stiff, mechanical gait, it wasn't right. Curiosity got the better of him. Despite his growing unease, Greg followed. The figure led him to the very edge of the cemetery, where the gravestones became sparse, and the trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and knotted. In the distance, Greg saw a strange monument, a large stone structure, different from the others. It was covered in thick layers of moss, and the symbols etched into the stone were unlike anything he had seen before. As he stepped closer, he noticed the air around the monument felt wrong heavy, charged with something dark and ancient. When the figure reached the monument, it stopped, and for the first time, Greg saw its face. It was pale, almost as if it had never seen sunlight, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into Greg's soul. Its lips were cracked and dry, as though it hadn't spoken in years. "Who are you?" Greg demanded, his voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't speak, but instead it raised a hand and pointed to the stone monument. Greg looked closer and saw that the symbols on the stone were not just carved into the surface. They were moving, shifting as though they were alive. The symbols began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the beating of Greg's heart. The air grew thick with a strange energy, and suddenly he felt as though he were being pulled toward the monument. Unable to resist, a voice echoed in his mind, low and grating, as if it were coming from the very earth itself. "You are here because you were meant to be." Greg staggered backward, his head spinning. "No, this can't be happening." The figure stepped closer, its face now inches from Greg's. Its eyes, though empty, seemed to burn with an intensity that made Greg's blood run cold. "You will join us," the figure whispered, its voice like the rasp of dry leaves in the wind. "You will be part of the winter's curse." Greg tried to turn and run, but his body felt like lead, as though the very air around him had turned to stone. The figure raised its hand, and the ground beneath Greg's feet trembled. Suddenly, the earth cracked open, and from the fissure, tendrils of ice began to rise, wrapping around his legs and pulling him toward the monument. The last thing Greg saw before he was consumed by the freezing grip of the ground was the figure's smile. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. It was a thing of the earth, an ancient spirit tied to the cursed cemetery. And as the tendrils of ice wrapped around him, pulling him into the earth, Greg understood. The cemetery wasn't just a burial ground. It was a prison, a place where the cursed souls of the dead were trapped, waiting for someone like him to come along. When the storm cleared, a local farmer, Henry, went to check on the cemetery. He had noticed a strange chill in the air that morning and had heard rumors about strange happenings near the old graveyard. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but the cemetery had always made him uneasy. As he walked to the far corner, near the monument, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A fresh grave. But there was no tombstone, no marking at all. Just a patch of frozen earth, where the snow had strangely avoided settling. Henry didn't stay long. He had seen enough. Story 5. The Snowbound Motel. Sarah had always enjoyed winter getaways, but she never expected a simple road trip to take such a terrifying turn. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway with her fiancé, Tim, a brief escape from the stresses of work. They had planned to drive up the coast of Northern California with its snow-capped mountains and misty forests, finding an isolated place to stay for a couple of nights. It was supposed to be idyllic, a perfect way to unwind. But when they found themselves stranded in the middle of nowhere during an unexpected snowstorm, things quickly took a dark turn. The snow had begun to fall heavily about an hour into their drive, thick flakes tumbling from the sky, blanketing the road in a thick white layer. Tim had suggested turning back, but Sarah had been determined. They were almost halfway to their destination, and the storm seemed to be moving in fast. She was confident they could find a place to wait out the storm. They both had snow tires on the car, and she didn't want to let the weather ruin their plans. But soon, the snow intensified. The road became nearly impassable, and visibility was next to nothing. Trees were lost in the storm, and the highway ahead was nothing more than a blanket of white, stretching endlessly before them. After another hour of creeping along the icy road, Tim's nerves were starting to fray. "We're not going to make it much farther," he said, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Sarah looked out the window, trying to assess their options. They were deep in the forest now, far from the nearest town. The idea of turning around and trying to navigate the storm seemed just as daunting as pressing on. "Let's find somewhere to stay. Just for the night. We can keep driving tomorrow morning when the snow clears up," Sarah suggested. Tim nodded reluctantly. They had passed a couple of old motels along the way, but none of them had seemed inviting. One of them was little more than a dilapidated shack. The other was so outdated, it looked like something out of a forgotten horror movie, with peeling paint and rusty signs that looked like they hadn't been changed in decades. As luck would have. Just as the storm began to worsen, they spotted a sign on the side of the road. Snowbound Motel. It looked like it had been standing for years, but the lights in the windows were still on. The sign was old, with faded letters, but the building itself seemed well maintained. A small snow-covered parking lot sat in front, with only one car parked near the entrance. "We might as well stop here," Tim said, pulling into the lot. "I don't think we're going to find anything better." As they entered the lobby, the warmth of the place was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. The air smelled of wood and old perfume, the kind of stale scent that came with age. The motel's interior was dimly lit, with worn-out furniture and faded wallpaper. The room was quiet, too quiet. No background music, no chatter from other guests. Only the soft hum of a heater running in the corner. A woman behind the counter greeted them with a forced smile. She was middle-aged, with sharp features and a slightly unsettling air about her. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her expression was unusually stern. "Hello," Sarah said, offering a polite smile. "We need a room for the night. It's snowing pretty heavily out there." The woman eyed them both for a long moment before responding. "You're lucky to have made it here. Most people turn back when the storm hits. We don't get many visitors at this time of year." Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the strange vibe coming from the woman. "It's just for the night. We'll leave as soon as the snow clears up tomorrow." The woman's smile seemed to falter, and her eyes darted to the door behind them. "We only have one room left. It's been vacant for a while, but I'm sure it'll suit you just fine." Sarah glanced at Tim, who was already making his way toward the room key. The woman handed it over with a slight hesitation, as though weighing something in her mind. The silence between them grew heavy. "Room 12, she said. "Just be careful. Don't go out in the storm. Stay inside." "We will." "Thanks," Tim replied, taking the key from her. The woman gave a single nod, her gaze lingering on them before she turned back to her desk. Room 12 was at the very end of the hallway, tucked away in a corner of the motel. The door creaked when Tim opened it, and Sarah felt a slight chill run through her. The room was old, with furniture that hadn't been updated in decades, but it was warm. There was a king-sized bed in the center, a small desk, and a rusted heater humming in the corner. The wallpaper was peeling in some places, and the carpet felt thin underfoot, but it was functional. Tim went to take a look outside through the window, but the storm had obscured any view. The snow was so thick that it looked like the world outside had been swallowed up by the white abyss. "I guess this will have to do," Sarah said, trying to put a positive spin on it. She sat down on the edge of the bed and stretched her tired muscles. "Not the worst place we've stayed in." "Yeah, definitely not the worst," Tim agreed, but his voice lacked enthusiasm. He seemed uncomfortable, though he didn't say. Rachel decided to settle in, unpacking her bag and fixing herself a hot cup of tea. She was just about to ask Tim if he wanted one when she heard something, a soft thud from somewhere in the hall, followed by a dragging sound. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone or something was moving slowly through the hallway outside their door. Tim raised an eyebrow, looking toward the door. "Did you hear that?" Rachel nodded, her heart beginning to race. "Yeah, it sounded like someone's dragging something." Tim went to the door and opened it a crack, but there was nothing, just the empty, dimly lit hallway stretching out before them. The motel was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. No one was there. He stepped back into the room, closing the door. "Weird. Maybe it's the old building settling or something." "Yeah," Rachel said, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She felt a creeping sense of unease settle in her stomach. Probably just the storm. They tried to shake it off, but the unsettling feeling lingered. After a quick dinner of takeout pizza, they settled into the bed with the storm raging outside, and the room growing colder. Sarah pulled the blankets tighter around her, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to fill the space. The dragging sound continued, muffled but consistent. It wasn't as loud as it had been earlier, but it was there. A slow, deliberate scraping sound. She tried to ignore it, focusing on Tim's steady breathing next to her. But the sound persisted closer now, almost as if it were right outside their door. She sat up, heart hammering in her chest. "Tim, I think there's someone out there." He looked at her, his eyes wide with concern. "Are you sure?" Before she could respond, the door handle rattled just once, as though someone was testing it. Both of them froze, staring at the door. Tim got up, slowly and cautiously, but just as he reached for the door, the handle rattled again. This time, more forcefully. "Who's there?" Tim called out, his voice low but demanding. The hallway outside was silent. There was no answer. They both stood there, paralyzed by the silence. The sound of the snowstorm outside drowned out any other noise, leaving only the eerie quiet of the room. After what felt like an eternity, Tim finally reached for the doorknob. He pulled the door open, and to his surprise, no one was there. Hallway stretched out, empty and cold, but there, at the very end of the hall, standing in the shadows near the staircase, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it was tall, and it moved toward them, dragging something heavy behind it. Tim closed the door. Sarah screamed, her voice trembling. Before either of them could react, the figure took a step forward. Tim slammed the door shut with a loud crash, locking it. Their breath came in quick, shallow bursts, both of them now wide awake, hearts racing. The dragging sound had stopped, but something far more disturbing had taken its place, a whisper. A faint voice murmuring just outside their door. "Let me in." Story 4. The Echo in the Tunnel. Emma had always prided herself on being level-headed and rational. After years of working in a fast-paced city environment, she had learned to be pragmatic, to push through discomfort, and to ignore things that didn't make sense. Her friends often described her as the logical one, the one they turned to when they needed a solution to a problem. But even she couldn't ignore the strange pull that had led her to Northern California's dense. Story 5. The Snowbound. Motel Sarah had always enjoyed winter getaways, but she never expected a simple road trip to take such a terrifying turn. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway with her fiancé, Tim, a brief escape from the stresses of work. They had planned to drive up the coast of Northern California, with its snow-capped mountains and misty forests, finding an isolated place to stay for a couple of nights. It was supposed to be idyllic, a perfect way to unwind, but when they found themselves stranded in the middle of nowhere during an unexpected snowstorm, things quickly took a dark turn. The snow had begun to fall heavily about an hour into their drive, thick flakes tumbling from the sky, blanketing the road in a thick white layer. Tim had suggested turning back, but Sarah had been determined. They were almost halfway to their destination, and the storm seemed to be moving in fast. She was confident they could find a place to wait out the storm. They both had snow tires on the car, and she didn't want to let the weather ruin their plans. But soon the snow intensified. The road became nearly impassable, and visibility was next to nothing. Trees were lost in the storm, and the highway ahead was nothing more than a blanket of white, stretching endlessly before them. After another hour of creeping along the icy road, Tim's nerves were starting to fray. "We're not going to make it much farther," he said, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Sarah looked out the window, trying to assess their options. They were deep in the forest now, far from the nearest town. The idea of turning around and trying to navigate the storm seemed just as daunting as pressing on. "Let's find somewhere to stay, just for the night. We can keep driving tomorrow morning when the snow clears up," Sarah suggested. Tim nodded reluctantly. They had passed a couple of old motels along the way, but none of them had seemed inviting. One of them was little more than a dilapidated shack. The other was so outdated, it looked like something out of a forgotten horror movie, with peeling paint and rusty signs that looked like they hadn't been changed in decades. As luck would have it, just as the storm began to worsen, they spotted a sign on the side of the road, "Snowbound Motel." It looked like it had been standing for years, but the lights in the windows were still on. The sign was old, with faded letters, but the building itself seemed well maintained. A small snow-covered parking lot sat in front, with only one car parked near the entrance. "We might as well stop here," Tim said, pulling into the lot. "I don't think we're going to find anything better." As they entered the lobby, the warmth of the place was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. The air smelled of wood and old perfume, the kind of stale scent that came with age. The motel's interior was dimly lit, with worn-out furniture and faded wallpaper. The room was quiet, too quiet. No background music, no chatter from other guests. Only the soft hum of a heater running in the corner. A woman behind the counter greeted them with a forced smile. She was middle-aged, with sharp features and a slightly unsettling air about her. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her expression was unusually stern. "Hello," Sarah said, offering a polite smile. "We need a room for the night. It's snowing pretty heavily out there." The woman eyed them both for a long moment before responding. "You're lucky to have made it here. Most people turn back when the storm hits. We don't get many visitors at this time of year." Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the strange vibe coming from the woman. "It's just for the night. We'll leave as soon as the snow clears up tomorrow." The woman's smile seemed to falter, and her eyes darted to the door behind them. "We only have one room left. It's been vacant for a while, but I'm sure it'll suit you just fine." Sarah glanced at Tim, who was already making his way toward the room key. The woman handed it over with a slight hesitation, as though weighing something in her mind. The silence between them grew heavy. "Room 12, she said. "Just be careful. Don't go out in the storm. Stay inside." "We will." "Thanks," Tim replied, taking the key from her. The woman gave a single nod, her gaze lingering on them before she turned back to her desk. Room 12 was at the very end of the hallway, tucked away in a corner of the motel. The door creaked when Tim opened it, and Sarah felt a slight chill run through her. The room was old, with furniture that hadn't been updated in decades, but it was warm. There was a king-sized bed in the center, a small desk, and a rusted heater humming in the corner. The wallpaper was peeling in some places, and the carpet felt thin underfoot, but it was functional. Tim went to take a look outside through the window, but the storm had obscured any view. The snow was so thick that it looked like the world outside had been swallowed up by the white abyss. "I guess this will have to do," Sarah said, trying to put a positive spin on it. She sat down on the edge of the bed and stretched her tired muscles. "Not the worst place we've stayed in." "Yeah, definitely not the worst," Tim agreed, but his voice lacked enthusiasm. He seemed uncomfortable, though he didn't say. Rachel decided to settle in, unpacking her bag and fixing herself a hot cup of tea. She was just about to ask Tim if he wanted one when she heard something, a soft thud from somewhere in the hall, followed by a dragging sound. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone or something was moving slowly through the hallway outside their door. Tim raised an eyebrow, looking toward the door. "Did you hear that?" Rachel nodded, her heart beginning to race. "Yeah, it sounded like someone's dragging something." Tim went to the door and opened it a crack, but there was nothing, just the empty, dimly lit hallway stretching out. Before them, the motel was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. No one was there. He stepped back into the room, closing the door. "Weird. Maybe it's the old building settling or something." "Yeah," Rachel said, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She felt a creeping sense of unease settle in her stomach. Probably just the storm. They tried to shake it off, but the unsettling feeling lingered. After a quick dinner of takeout pizza, they settled into the bed, with the storm raging outside, and the room growing colder. Sarah pulled the blankets tighter around her, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to fill the space. The dragging sound continued, muffled but consistent. It wasn't as loud as it had been earlier, but it was there. A slow, deliberate scraping sound. She tried to ignore it, focusing on Tim's steady breathing next to her. But the sound persisted closer now, almost as if it were right outside their door. She sat up, heart hammering in her chest. "Tim, I think there's someone out there." He looked at her, his eyes wide with concern. "Are you sure?" Before she could respond, the door handle rattled, just once. As though someone was testing it. Both of them froze, staring at the door. Tim got up, slowly and cautiously, but just as he reached for the door, the handle rattled again, this time more forcefully. "Who's there?" Tim called out, his voice low but demanding. The hallway outside was silent. There was no answer. They both stood there, paralyzed by the silence. The sound of the snowstorm outside drowned out any other noise, leaving only the eerie quiet of the room. After what felt like an eternity, Tim finally reached for the doorknob. He pulled the door open, and to his surprise, no one was there. Hallway stretched out, empty and cold. But there, at the very end of the hall, standing in the shadows near the staircase, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it was tall, and it moved toward them, dragging something heavy behind it. Tim closed the door. Sarah screamed, her voice trembling. Before either of them could react, the figure took a step forward. Tim slammed the door shut with a loud crash, locking it. Their breath came in quick, shallow bursts, both of them now wide awake, hearts racing. The dragging sound had stopped, but something far more disturbing had taken its place, a whisper. A faint voice murmuring just outside their door. "Let me in." Wilderness on this cold winter weekend. It all started with a sudden desire for adventure. Emma had read about a secluded trail that led to an old mining tunnel abandoned for decades, but still accessible to those brave enough to explore. The tunnel, according to the guidebooks, was part of a forgotten ghost town that had once thrived during the gold rush era. Now it sat quietly in the shadow of the towering redwoods, surrounded by thick forests and steep, rugged hills. When Emma found out she had a long weekend off, she didn't hesitate. She packed her bag, rented a car, and headed north, eager to leave behind the noise and the pressures of her daily life. She had always been drawn to the unknown, to places where history lingered in the silence, and the air was thick with untold stories. This, she thought, would be the perfect escape. The drive took her deep into the mountains, where the road became narrower and the trees taller. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, and soon Emma found herself in a forest that felt untouched by time. The sun was already setting as she pulled up to the trailhead. A small sign marked the beginning of the path. The weather had been unpredictable all day, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the ground in soft, powdery white. Emma pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, glancing at the trail that stretched ahead into the thick woods. The path was well maintained but remote, and no other cars were parked at the trailhead. She felt an odd sense of solitude, peaceful yet unsettling. She checked her phone briefly, but the signal was weak, and there was no sign of other hikers. It was just her and the forest now. With a deep breath, Emma decided to press forward, her boots crunching in the fresh snow as she followed the narrow trail. The further she walked, the quieter the forest seemed to get. The snow muffled everything, even the sounds of birds or rustling animals. The only noise she could hear was the steady crunch of her boots, the occasional snap of a branch, and the occasional howl of wind through the trees. The stillness was almost unnatural. After about an hour of hiking, Emma began to feel the weight of the isolation settle around her. The air was growing colder, and the darkness was starting to creep in. The tunnel was supposed to be only a few miles ahead, but she began to wonder if she should turn back. The thought crossed her mind, but curiosity drove her forward. Just as the shadows of the trees began to grow longer, Emma reached the end of the trail. There, hidden among the thick trunks of ancient redwoods, she saw it, the entrance to the tunnel. The opening was just a dark, gaping maw in the side of the hill, surrounded by tangled underbrush and twisted branches. Above the entrance, carved into the rock, was a weathered sign that read Eureka Tunnel in faded, chipped paint. Emma stood for a moment, her breath visible in the cold air, staring into the darkness of the tunnel. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, but she quickly shook off the feeling. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Grabbing her flashlight from her backpack, Emma stepped forward, the beam cutting through the darkness. The tunnel was narrow and low-ceilinged, with jagged rocks and uneven ground. The air inside was cold and musty, a faint smell of damp earth filling her nostrils. As she ventured deeper into the tunnel, the sound of her footsteps echoed off the stone walls, amplifying the eerie silence. The deeper she went, the more she began to notice strange markings along the walls, etched symbols and old carvings that had been there for years, perhaps even centuries. Some looked like crude drawings, while others resembled strange, twisting patterns. Emma's flashlight flickered briefly, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls that seemed to stretch and move as if they had a life of their own. Her mind raced. Was this the work of the miners who had used this tunnel? Or was there something more to it? The further she walked, the more the tunnel seemed to stretch, becoming an endless, dark passageway that felt like it was pulling her deeper. As Emma pressed forward, she began to feel a strange sensation, like something was watching her. She paused, scanning the darkness around her, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted, and her heart began to race. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. After all, this was just an old tunnel, nothing more. But as she turned a corner, she saw something that stopped her dead in her tracks. At the far end of the tunnel, a faint light flickered. Emma squinted, unsure if it was her eyes playing tricks on her, but as she moved closer, she realized it was definitely a light, small, almost like a candle flickering in the dark. She took a cautious step forward, then another. The light seemed to beckon her, pulling her toward it. The air around her grew colder still, and the eerie quiet of the tunnel deepened. It felt like the walls were closing in, and her footsteps were no longer her own. When she reached the light, she saw something else, something that made her blood run cold. There, standing in the center of the tunnel, was a figure. A man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. His clothes were ragged, tattered, as though they had been worn for years. He was standing completely still, his hands hanging at his sides, his gaze locked onto Emma's. For a moment, she stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The man didn't make a sound, but his eyes seemed to pierce into her, as though he could see deep into her soul. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his lips were twisted in a faint, unsettling smile. Who are you?" Emma managed to choke out, her voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. He simply stood there, staring. Then, the faint light in his hand flickered, and Emma noticed something else. His reflection in the damp walls of the tunnel wasn't right. His figure seemed to twist and distort, flickering like a shadow in the dim light. That was when Emma realized he wasn't real. Before she could react, the air around her grew cold. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in, the ground beneath her feet shifting as if it were alive. The whispering started soft at first, like the wind, but growing louder, more insistent. It was a voice, a low, rasping voice that echoed off the stone. "Help me," it whispered. "Help me." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to run, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to buckle and twist. The tunnel was no longer just a tunnel. It had become a maze, a living entity that shifted and moved around her. She stumbled, her feet slipping on the uneven stone, as the walls seemed to press in on all sides. "Help me." The voice was louder now, closer. The man's figure had disappeared, but his presence remained, suffocating her as she ran blindly through the tunnel, her flashlight flickering erratically. She turned corners, her breath coming in gasps, but the tunnel stretched endlessly before her. She couldn't see the end, couldn't find her way out. And then, just when she thought she couldn't go any further, she heard a sound of soft scraping, as though something was moving toward her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she whirled around, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. And there it was, a figure crawling toward her from the shadows. It was bent, distorted, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, those hollow eyes, stared at her, unblinking. The thing moved with a terrible slowness, its body contorting with every movement, but its eyes were fixed on her. "Help me." The voice was unmistakable. Now, and it was coming from the thing in front of her. Emma screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the tunnel. The figure reached for her, its fingers long and skeletal, its nails sharp and black. She scrambled backward, her legs tangling in the rough terrain. The thing lunged at her, and for the briefest moment, everything went black. When Emma woke, she was no longer in the tunnel. She was lying on the cold ground, her body aching. The world was silent, and the air was still. She stood up slowly, her head spinning, and looked around. She was back at the entrance of the tunnel. The forest around her was silent. The snow had stopped falling, and the wind had died down. The tunnel behind her was now just a dark opening. In the hillside, no longer threatening, no longer alive, but something had changed. Emma's heart raced in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder. The feeling of being watched was gone, but the weight of what had happened in that tunnel lingered. Like a shadow she couldn't escape. She left the tunnel behind, never looking back, but she knew deep down that she would never forget the figure, the man whose voice still echoed in her mind. "Help me." Story 3. Frozen Waters. Ethan had always considered himself a skeptic, especially when it came to the old superstitions that locals loved to whisper about. A recent transfer to a small town near Lake Tahoe, Ethan wasn't particularly fond of. The isolation or the endless talk of spirits in the lake and cursed waters that he'd overheard during his first few days in town. He had heard all the stories before, growing up in a city where old myths were just that, stories. But now, here he was, spending the winter in a remote mountain town where the locals seemed to believe in something more sinister. At first, he thought the town's strange customs were just eccentricities, a quaint part of the charm that came with living somewhere so remote. The warnings from the old men at the diner, the side glances from the mothers when he mentioned the lake, and the stories of the old man of the lake who had drowned many years ago, all felt like the ramblings of people who didn't have much else to talk about in the dead of winter. It wasn't till his second week in town that Ethan finally decided to take a day off and do something he hadn't had the chance to do yet. Go ice fishing on the frozen surface of Lake Tahoe. His neighbors had been more than eager to point out the best spots, all telling him that it was an experience he wouldn't want to miss. They were all so enthusiastic about it, Ethan figured. There had to be something to it. So he bundled up in his warmest clothes, grabbed his gear, and drove down to the lake's edge. As he made his way toward the shore, he was struck by the eerie stillness of the place. The snow was undisturbed, blanketing the ground in a perfect layer of white, and the lake itself seemed like an endless stretch of white ice. The air was so cold, it bit at his skin, but there was something oddly peaceful about the way everything appeared to be frozen in time. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots against the snow and the wind howling through the bare trees that lined the lake. He set up his gear on the ice, drilling a hole through the thick, clear surface, watching. The cold water swirled beneath him as he dropped his fishing line. As he sat there waiting for a bite, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creep up on him. There was something about the place that felt wrong, like the lake was holding a secret, something ancient, something that shouldn't be disturbed. An old man, who had been fishing a few yards away, noticed Ethan sitting by himself and wandered over, his breath visible in the icy air. He was bundled in heavy layers, his face weathered and gray, his eyes sharp but filled with a quiet sorrow. "You a newcomer?" the old man asked, his voice rasping from years of exposure to the cold. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, just moved here for work. Thought I'd try ice fishing. It's supposed to be a big deal around here." The old man's lips twisted into a thin smile, but there was a darkness in his eyes. "Big deal, huh? Well, you better be careful out here. You don't want to end up like the others." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The others?" The old man spat into the snow. "People don't come out to the lake when the ice is this thick. People from the town, they know better. They've got their stories. You should listen to them." Ethan chuckled, trying to dismiss the tension in the air. "Stories, huh? What kind of stories?" The old man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "You know about the old man of the lake? About how he died?" Ethan shrugged. "Yeah, I've heard the rumors. Some old fisherman drowned out here, right? It's just a legend." The old man's eyes narrowed, and he looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be listening. "It's no legend. The old man was a fisherman, sure. But it wasn't an accident. He knew too much. He got too close to the lake's heart. Now, they say his spirit's still out there, wandering the ice, pulling people down into the deep." Ethan laughed again, though this time the sound felt forced. "Come on, you really expect me to believe that?" The old man's expression hardened, and he took a step back. "You'll see soon enough. People come out here all the time, and some of them, they don't come back." Ethan shook his head, trying to ignore the chill creeping up his spine. "I'm sure it's just a superstition." "I'm fine, thanks." The old man didn't say anything more. He simply nodded, turned, and walked away, disappearing back into the fog of the snowstorm that was rolling in from the mountains. Ethan shrugged off the encounter and went back to fishing, trying to convince himself that it was nothing more than the ramblings of a lonely old man. But despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that the old man had been trying to tell him something important. The weather grew worse as the day went on. The wind picked up, howling across the lake, and the snow began to fall more heavily, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Ethan decided it was time to pack up and head back to his car, but as he turned to leave, something strange caught his eye. A figure stood near the edge of the ice, at the far side of the lake. It was too far away to make out clearly, but the figure was tall and hunched, dressed in ragged clothing. Ethan squinted, trying to make sense of it. For a moment, the figure seemed to stare directly at him, unmoving. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the swirling snow. Ethan's heart raced as he tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that gripped him. It was probably just someone else out fishing, or maybe even a trick of the snow. But the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something didn't feel right. He packed up his gear quickly, eager to get back to the warmth of his car. But as he began to walk toward the shore, the ice under his feet creaked loudly, like a deep groan from the earth itself. The sound reverberated through the frozen ground, and for the briefest moment, Ethan thought he felt the ground shift beneath him. The air grew colder, and the wind picked up again. He glanced behind him, but there was no one there. The lake was silent again, its surface smooth, save for the faint lines where his footprints had been. But as he continued his walk toward the shore, he heard something, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, coming from deep within the ice. His heart pounded in his chest as he broke into a run, the wind howling louder now, the sound of something someone chasing him. He didn't dare look back as he sprinted toward the shore, the snow stinging his face. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his heart beat faster than it ever had before. When he finally reached the edge of the lake, he dared a glance over his shoulder. Nothing. The lake was as still as ever. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared. But as he turned back to the parking lot, he felt a strange, cold presence beside him. He glanced down at his boots, expecting to see his own footprints leading away from the shore. But there, in the snow, was a fresh set of tracks, large, heavy, and far too deep to belong to anyone else. They led away from the water and into the dense forest dot, and then a voice, a low, echoing whisper from the ice reached his ears. Leave. Now, before it's too late. Ethan didn't waste any time. He didn't look back as he sprinted to his car, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. His hands shook as he started the engine, and as he looked in the rearview mirror, he could have sworn he saw something standing by the water's edge, just barely visible through the falling snow. The rest of the drive back to town was uneventful, but the unease never left him. The figure, the whispers, the unsettling sound from the ice, they all haunted him, nagging at the edges of his thoughts. That night, as he lay in bed, trying to shake off the fear that gripped him, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. You were warned. The message sent a chill down his spine, and he immediately deleted it. But no matter how hard he tried to forget, Ethan knew deep down that the lake hadn't let him go. It had marked him, and soon the lake's restless spirit would come for him. The next day, the storm had cleared. Ethan went back to the lake, determined to face whatever had been haunting him. He stood at the water's edge, the snow now gone, but a heavy fog hung over the surface of the lake. He took a deep breath, looking out over the water, and then, in the distance, he saw it. The figure from before, standing at the edge of the ice. The old man of the lake was waiting for him. Story 2. The Winter House. Lisa had never liked the idea of spending holidays in remote, isolated places. The thought of the small, quiet cabin in the middle of nowhere seemed foreign to her, like something out of a horror movie. But when her friends, Sarah and Emily, convinced her to join them for a winter getaway in the snowy mountains near Big Bear Lake, she reluctantly agreed. They promised it would be the perfect escape from their hectic lives, a way to unwind and catch up. A cozy, secluded retreat. What could possibly go wrong? The drive up the winding mountain roads was long, especially with the heavy snowfall that had begun just after they left the city. The roads were slick with ice, and Lisa found herself gripping the sides of her seat as the car swerved slightly on the snowy turns. Despite the discomfort, she tried to stay positive, reminding herself that it would be worth it once they got there. Sarah, who had rented the cabin, reassured them over and over that the house was beautiful and well-equipped, a perfect blend of rustic charm and modern comfort. As they finally approached the cabin, the snowflakes swirled around them, obscuring their view of the world outside. The cabin was nestled against a backdrop of towering pines, their branches heavy with snow. The dark wood of the house stood out against the whiteness of the snow, giving it an almost fairy tale quality. There was something peaceful about it, but the longer Lisa stared, the more uneasy she felt. Here we are, Sarah exclaimed, turning off the engine. Our home for the weekend. The cabin was quaint, with a large porch covered in fresh snow, the windows glowing warmly. Lisa couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding as they climbed out of the car and approached the front door. The wind howled through the trees, sending shivers down her spine, but her friends were already excitedly unloading the car. Unaware of the unease settling in Lisa's stomach. Inside, the cabin was cozy, but had an old, worn feel to it. The fireplace crackled with warmth, and there was a thick layer of dust on most of the furniture, suggesting that it had been abandoned for some time. The walls were adorned with old family photographs, some of them faded, others almost too pristine, as if they had been recently cleaned. The furniture, though comfortable, had a vintage quality, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wood, mixed with something else, something musty, like the house hadn't been properly aired out in years. "It's perfect, right?" Emily said, tossing her coat onto one of the chairs and stretching. "I love how cozy it is." Lisa smiled weakly, but couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was wrong. "Yeah, it's nice. What's wrong?" Sarah asked, noticing Lisa's hesitation. "You okay?" "Yeah," Lisa said, shaking off her unease. "Just tired, I guess." They spent the evening unpacking and settling in, trying to ignore the strange sense of isolation that had settled around them. The wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall heavier, obscuring their view of the surrounding woods. There was no sign of other houses nearby, just an endless expanse of trees and white. After dinner, they gathered around the fire, sipping wine and chatting about old memories from college. Lisa tried her best to relax, but the old cabin kept pulling at her nerves, like something from the past was lurking in the shadows. She kept glancing at the photographs on the walls, at the old furniture, at the way the shadows seemed to twist and stretch in the flickering firelight. It was as if the house itself was holding a secret, something it didn't want anyone to know. She didn't want to say anything to her friends, though. They were happy, and she didn't want to ruin the mood. So she kept quiet, forcing herself to enjoy the evening. But sleep didn't come easily that night. It was just after midnight when Lisa was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. Her heart raced, and she sat up in bed, listening. The wind outside howled loudly, and the house creaked in response. But there was something else, something soft, like the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat. She lay there for a long moment, staring into the darkness of the room, her eyes straining to make out any movement. But there was nothing, no one was there. It was probably just the house settling, she thought. But the sound had been so real, so distinct. She glanced over at Sarah, who was still asleep in the bed next to her, unaware of the strange noises. Lisa pulled the covers tighter around her, trying to calm her racing pulse. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. The house fell quiet again, but the feeling of unease didn't leave her. She tried to push it away, telling herself she was just imagining things. After all, it was an old house. It would make odd noises. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next day, they spent the morning exploring the surrounding area. The snow was thick on the ground, and the woods surrounding the cabin were dense and quiet. There was a peaceful stillness in the air, broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow. Lisa kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone following them, but every time she turned around, the woods were empty. "Hey, you guys want to check out the old cemetery?" Sarah asked, pointing through the trees to a small clearing in the distance. "I heard it's just a short walk from here." Lisa felt a chill creep up her spine at the mention of a cemetery, but she didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. "Sure," she said, forcing a smile. "Why not?" They made their way through the woods, the snow now deep enough to slow their progress. After about 20 minutes of walking, they finally reached the small cemetery. The headstones were old and worn, some leaning at strange angles, others partially buried under a blanket of snow. The air felt heavy, as if the weight of the past was pressing down on them. "This place is creepy," Emily said, standing near a large, cracked gravestone. "It feels like no one's been here in forever." "I don't know," Sarah said, stepping closer to a small monument at the far end of the cemetery. There's something peaceful about it. It feels like the kind of place where you can really think. Lisa looked around uneasily, but something caught her eye, an old weathered stone that wasn't like the others. It was set apart from the rest of the graves, near the back of the cemetery, almost hidden by the snow. She walked over to it, curiosity gnawing at her. The stone was engraved with intricate symbols, unfamiliar to her. There was no name, just the symbols, and something about them made her skin crawl. As her fingers brushed the surface of the stone, she felt a strange chill run through her body, a sensation she couldn't explain. "Lisa, are you okay?" Sarah asked, coming up behind her. Lisa pulled her hand back quickly, suddenly feeling lightheaded. "Yeah, I don't know. I don't like this place." The wind picked up again, and the temperature seemed to drop even further, making the air feel colder than it should have been for a winter afternoon. She glanced around at the other headstones, feeling an overwhelming sense of unease. "We should go back," Lisa said, her voice shaking slightly. "This place feels wrong." Her friends agreed, and they quickly made their way back to the cabin. But as they walked, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to close in around them, their shadows darkening the path, and the further they walked, the more oppressive the air became. That night, the storm worsened. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the cabin. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, but Lisa felt colder than she had all day. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, there was a noise, soft at first, but growing louder. It was a tapping sound, coming from the window. Lisa sat up, her heart racing. She glanced over at Sarah, who was still asleep, unaware. The tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent. Slowly, Lisa got out of bed, her feet cold on the floor, and tiptoed toward the window. When she peeked outside, she saw nothing. Just the heavy snowfall, drifting silently through the night. But when she turned back toward the room, she froze. There, standing at the foot of her bed, was a figure dot. It was tall, thin, and dressed in a long, dark coat. Its face was obscured, but Lisa could feel its presence, cold, unsettling, like a shadow that had come to life. Before she could scream, the figure vanished, disappearing into the air like smoke. Lisa gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She stumbled backward, but Sarah remained oblivious, still deep in her sleep. She backed away from the window, trembling, her thoughts racing. What had she seen? Had it been real? The tapping continued, louder now, more frantic, dot with shaking hands. Lisa turned and fled from the room. She didn't care if Sarah woke up. She needed to get out of that cabin. The next morning, they packed their bags in silence, the storm still raging outside. As they drove away from the cabin, Lisa glanced back at the snow-covered trees, the cemetery still standing silently in the end. Distance. The memories of the figure, the tapping, and the feeling of being watched stayed with her long after they left. They never spoke of it again. Story 1. The Whispering Pines. Sarah had always been drawn to the quiet. Growing up in the city, she had been surrounded by noise, the hum of traffic, the endless conversations of strangers, a constant buzz of life. But every once in a while, she longed for silence, for a place where she could be alone with her thoughts, away from the chaos of the world. That was why, when her best friend invited her to spend a long weekend in a secluded cabin in the northern forests of California, Sarah didn't hesitate. She was desperate for a break from her hectic life, and the idea of getting away to a quiet, remote cabin surrounded by nothing but trees and snow sounded like the perfect escape. The cabin was located in a small town called Whispering Pines, nestled deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was the kind of place that you could drive past 1,000 times without ever noticing it. The kind of place that would vanish in the blink of an eye if you weren't careful. The weather had already begun to turn cold, and snow was expected to arrive by the time they got there, covering everything in a blanket of white. It felt like the perfect winter retreat, peaceful, isolated, and far from the pressures of work and daily life. Sarah's friend Emily was already there when she arrived, waiting on the front porch of the cabin with a warm smile. The two embraced, laughing as Sarah stepped out of the car and stretched, feeling the cold mountain air fill her lungs. "This is exactly what we needed," Emily said, her breath coming out in puffs of mist. "A weekend of no phones, no distractions, just us and the woods." Sarah smiled, even as she noticed the strange feeling that seemed to settle in her chest. There was something about the cabin, something about the way the trees surrounded it, that made her feel uneasy. But she chalked it up to the fact that it was her first time in such an isolated place. She had never been one for camping or anything remotely similar. But if Emily was happy, then she was willing to make the best of it. The inside of the cabin was charming, a rustic living room with a large stone fireplace, comfortable armchairs, and bookshelves filled with old novels. The walls were made of dark wood, and the windows looked out onto the snow-covered pines. The place had a warmth to it, despite the cold outside. The fire crackled in the hearth as the two of them unpacked and settled in for the night, laughing and chatting about old times, trying to catch up on everything that had happened since they last saw each other. But as the night deepened, Sarah began to feel a strange unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling, a creeping sensation that she was being watched. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to the quiet of the place, the isolation, but it didn't go away. The wind outside howled against the windows, rattling the panes and making the trees creak and groan. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, pausing mid-sentence. "Hear what?" Emily replied, looking at her with a raised eyebrow. Sarah furrowed her brow. "It's probably nothing. Just the wind or something. But I thought I heard ... footsteps." "Footsteps?" Emily laughed. "Sarah, we're in the middle of nowhere. It's probably just the house settling." Sarah nodded, though the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave her. She tried to shake it off, focusing on their conversation and the warmth of the fire. But her mind kept wandering back to the strange sensation, the way the darkness outside seemed to press in on them, suffocating the cabin with its cold weight. Later that night, after they had finished their dinner and cleaned up, the two of them sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, with a glass of wine in hand. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows on the walls. It felt like they were the only two people left in the world. Everything outside was still, silent like the forest, was holding its breath. And then the whispering started. At first, it was faint, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah paused, setting her glass of wine down on the table. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emily looked up, her brow furrowed. "What?" "That whispering," Sarah said, glancing around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Emily shrugged. "I didn't hear anything." "Are you sure you're not imagining things?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the whispering came again, louder this time, clearer. It wasn't words, exactly, but a series of soft sounds, like someone breathing too close to your ear. She stood up from the couch, her hands trembling as she tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. I swear I'm not imagining this," Sarah said, her voice strained. "There's something here." Emily gave her a sympathetic look, getting up from the couch and placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, it's probably just the wind again. The house is old. Things creak and moan when it's this cold outside." Sarah nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stared at the walls, her gaze lingering on the corners of the room. The whispering had stopped, But now she felt like she was being drawn into the shadows, like something was waiting for her to get too close. "I'm going to check the door," she said, trying to calm her nerves. "Make sure everything's locked." Emily followed her to the door, but when they both turned the handle, it was already locked from the inside. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with unease. "That's weird," Emily muttered. "We locked it earlier, right?" Sarah nodded, though a cold chill ran through her. "Yeah, I'm sure we did." But as they turned back toward the living room, Sarah froze. There, in the dark corner of the room, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a figure. It was tall, slender, and hunched over, its head bowed low. Sarah couldn't make out its face, but she felt its eyes on her, cold and piercing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching M. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, "Her." Voice barely audible. Emily turned to look, but the figure was gone. The corner of the room was empty, the shadow stretching long and dark. "What the hell, Sarah? There's nothing there." "I swear it was there," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I saw it, a figure, standing in the corner." Emily looked at her, her expression softening. "You're freaked out from the storm and everything. I get it, but you've got to calm down." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. The house felt like it was closing in around her, its walls pressing in with an unseen weight. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but Sarah couldn't sleep. The sounds of the storm outside mixed with the silence of the house, and every creak, every moan of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She kept hearing things the soft, whispering, the faint scratch of footsteps in the hall outside. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about this place. At some point, she drifted off to sleep, though it wasn't restful. Her dreams were filled with shadows, whispers, and the image of the figure standing in the corner of the room, always watching, always waiting. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of Emily making coffee in the kitchen. She was still shaken, her nerves frayed, but she forced herself to get up and join her friend. The house felt a little less oppressive in the daylight, but the memory of the night before lingered. "I didn't sleep well," Sarah admitted, sitting down at the kitchen table. "There was something in the cabin last night." Emily paused, glancing over at her. "What do you mean? The whispering?" Sarah nodded. "And a figure. A man, I think. He was standing in the corner of the room." Emily gave her a concerned look. "Sarah, I know you're on edge, but you've got to stop letting your imagination run wild. There's nothing here. Just the storm and the isolation." But Sarah wasn't so sure anymore. She could still feel the weight of those unseen eyes, watching her. The whispers had stopped, but she knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, watching as they made their way out of the cabin to explore the woods surrounding the property. Sarah glanced back at the dark windows. She felt the pull again, the feeling that something was there, just beyond the glass, waiting. And in the stillness of the woods, the whispers began again. As Sarah and Emily ventured further into the woods, the whispers grew louder, echoing through the trees, but they weren't alone. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to something dark, something watching from the shadows. The chilling presence followed them, unseen yet undeniable. Sarah realized they had unwittingly stepped into something ancient, something that wouldn't let them leave. Will they escape, or will the whispers claim them forever? Stay tuned to uncover the terrifying truth. Make sure to subscribe for more spine-chilling tales, and remember, some secrets are best left undisturbed.